Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to cut through the noise and get you really well informed on complex issues. And today, it's a big one. We're diving into the recent collapse of the Gaza ceasefire talks. It's incredibly high stakes. We've looked through a whole stack of sources, different articles, some research, our own notes, trying to untangle this web of accusations, figure out the real obstacles, and crucially, understand the human impact.
Exactly. Our mission today really is to pull out the most important pieces of information for you, give you a solid grasp on why these talks broke down, who's pointing fingers at whom, and what all this means for the people actually living through this in Gaza.
And just to show how tangled this blame game gets right from the start, let's look at a statement from the U.S. side. Pretty striking. U.S. President Donald Trump didn't mince words. He asserted Hamas didn't really want to make a deal. He even speculated, saying he thought they want to die, which signaled U.S. backing for Israel to, quote, finish the job. That throws you right into the controversy, doesn't it?
It really does. And what's insightful here isn't just that they blame each other, but how these narratives seem to clash. They're often rooted in, fundamentally opposing strategic goals. For Hamas, it's got to be a permanent end to the war. For Israel, it's about the complete elimination of Hamas as a governing and military force. That gap, it makes compromise almost impossible. Any concession feels like giving up entirely to one side or the other.
That's a really crucial point to make right at the beginning. So, okay, let's unpack this blame game properly. Starting with the U.S. and Israeli view. President Trump's stance was, as we said, very strong, very public. He explicitly put the blame on Hamas, saying they didn't really want to make a deal. Why? Because, he suggested, they knew what happens after you get the final hostages. The implication being Hamas loses its shield or cover, as he put it. And he urged Israel to finish the job.
And it wasn't just Trump saying this in isolation. You see a consistent message from the American side. U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, he echoed those sentiments. He actually recalled the American negotiators from Doha in Qatar. Witkoff cited Hamas's, quote, lack of desire to reach a ceasefire, called their actions selfish and disappointing. He even suggested they weren't serious about ending the war, or maybe weren't even coordinated in how they approached the talks.
Okay, so a very clear, unified message there from the U.S. What about Israel's leader, Prime Minister Netanyahu? How did he frame it? Was it the same line, or were there specific Israeli demands adding complexity?
Netanyahu's position, well, it aligns very closely with that U.S. narrative. But he adds these layers of specific Israeli strategic aims. He publicly rejected Hamas's core demand for a permanent end to the war. He insisted Hamas must be fully destroyed, even after any captives are released. His office also pointed directly to Hamas's response as the reason for pulling the Israeli negotiating team out. And Netanyahu has been very firm, consistently, that Israel needs to keep control over the Philadelphia corridor, that border strip with Egypt, to stop weapons smuggling. Hamas sees that as a major block.
Interesting how closely those positions track. It does bring up that question about the U.S. role, though. Michael Hanna from the International Crisis Group, he commented on this. He noted this sort of consistent effort to fault Hamas for the lack of progress before. And crucially, he suggested the U.S. acts not a mediator, but more like a party to the discussions, especially since U.S. guarantees are apparently key to any deal. I mean, what does that do to the mediation process if one of the main facilitators is seen as being so strongly on one side?
That's such a critical point because, real mediation needs at least a perception of impartiality. And that's hard to maintain when one party, the U.S. here, is seen as so overtly backing the other, Israel. If the U.S. is viewed less as a neutral go-between and more like, part of Israel's negotiating team, it just undermines the trust you need for a breakthrough. It can make the other side, Hamas, in this case, dig their heels in even more, feeling like there's no truly impartial party they can appeal to. It really shows how tangled these dynamics are.
Incredibly tangled, yes. And we absolutely have to remember every narrative has its counter. When we look at Hamas's side, they're not just offering an alternative view, they're directly pushing back against the U.S. and Israeli claims, painting a very different picture of who's really blocking things.
Absolutely. Hamas has some very strong counter-arguments. They flatly rejected the U.S. criticism. Izzat al-Rush from Hamas's political bureau, he called the U.S. claims misguided and actually contradictory to the progress already made. He specifically pointed out that the actual mediators, Qatar and Egypt, had apparently praised Hamas's serious and constructive approach. That directly challenges the U.S. line about a lack of desire.
So Hamas is questioning the U.S. credibility directly there. Okay, beyond pushing back on the U.S., who do they see as the main obstacle, and what are their specific complaints?
They point the finger squarely at Israel. Hamas leader Khalil al-Hayya accused Israel of, quote, delaying ceasefire negotiations while intensifying its military offensive in Gaza. He said Hamas showed maximum flexibility during the talks and was surprised by the occupation's withdrawal and the American envoy's alignment with them. Hamas basically sees Netanyahu's government as the true obstructionist. They accuse them of deceiving and evading commitments by creating unnecessary hurdles. In short, they view Israel's actions as a deliberate play to keep the conflict going while just, pretending to negotiate.
So for Hamas, Israel pulling out wasn't a failure of the talks per se, but a strategic move, a way to buy time and increase military pressure. Given that view, what are Hamas's absolute core demands, the non-negotiables?
The fundamental one is this. Releasing captives must lead to a permanent end to the war. That seems non-negotiable for them. They've even said a whole new deal wasn't really needed because, in their view, they'd already agreed months ago to a truce framework laid out by President Biden. They keep warning people not to fall into what they call Netanyahu's trap, using talks just to prolong the fighting and hit military targets without actually committing to stopping hostilities for good.
And what about aid? Hamas has a very specific, very critical take on that too, right? Calling Israeli airdrops and these humanitarian corridors deceptive tactics.
Yes, and propaganda to mask ongoing siege, starvation. They go further, describing these efforts as a calculated policy to manage famine, not fix it. They've even called on Arab and Muslim nations to cut ties with Israel and organize protests that paints a picture of just complete mistrust on the aid front.
Absolutely. Okay, let's bring in the mediators themselves. Qatar and Egypt, they've been central to all this. What's their take?
Well, their perspective adds another layer. Qatari officials, for instance, tried to sort of downplay the U.S. pulling out its negotiators. They called the suspension of talks a natural matter in negotiations this complex and high stakes. They even mentioned that, despite the public breakdown, quite a bit of progress had actually been made behind the scenes.
So despite all the public blaming, their commitment seems to still be there. What does that suggest about the diplomatic work happening underneath?
It suggests that even when the public statements are really harsh, there's still a belief, or at least a hope, that a diplomatic path is possible. Or maybe just that the channels have to stay open. Both Qatar and Egypt have said they're still dedicated to getting a comprehensive ceasefire. However, Qatar's foreign ministry also took a shot directly at Israel. They warned that Israel's approach, based on, quote, falsifying facts and misleading world public opinion by repeating lies, would ultimately doom the peace efforts. So that's not just being neutral, that's a mediator explicitly calling out one party for undermining the whole process.
Right, so we have this really clear picture now of these deeply conflicting stories, this intense blame game. But amidst all the diplomatic chess moves, we have to keep remembering the human cost. It's just staggering. Gaza is literally descending deeper into hunger. And that's largely due to the full blockade Israel put in place back in March.
The humanitarian situation it's beyond dire. And the aid efforts, tragically, just haven't been effective enough, not even close. Take the U.S. and Israeli-backed Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, the GHF. It was set up in May, supposed to let some aid trickle in, but it's been, quote, plagued by scandals and slammed by aid experts, including the UN. Even worse, there are reports that over 1,000 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli forces just trying to get food since the GHF started. And these horrifying accounts of starving people being put in cage-like corrals or even shot at by U.S. mercenaries guarding these so-called distribution hubs.
That sounds absolutely horrific. Not just ineffective, but actively dangerous. What's the reported human toll from this hunger crisis, especially for children?
The numbers are just heartbreaking. The Hamas-run health ministry in Gaza has reported at least 133 deaths specifically from hunger-related causes, and 87 of those were children. The UN's World Food Program backed this up, reporting that about a third of Gaza's population wasn't eating for days at a time. Nearly 500,000 people were facing famine-like conditions. This isn't just, food insecurity anymore. It's mass starvation, directly tied to the conflict and the breakdown of everything.
Okay, so in response to this growing international outcry about the humanitarian disaster, Israel recently announced these daily 10-hour tactical pauses in some areas for aid. Has that made a real difference?
Well, the UN and the World Food Program welcome them as, a step, a recognition of the desperate need. But almost immediately, other international bodies, like the UK Foreign Secretary David Lammy, said it falls short of what is needed.
Yeah.
They called for a proper ceasefire that can end the war. So it's seen mostly as a minimal gesture, maybe to ease some pressure, but not a real solution to the crisis or the fighting.
And this is where we can loop back to something we touched on earlier, those broader concerns about long-term goals. Remember President Trump's statement from before, about the U.S. potentially taking over Gaza, displacing Palestinians, turning it into a Riviera. It seems extreme, but it connects to deeper fears, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Michael Hanna, the expert we mentioned, he explicitly observed that militarily, there are no real strategic objectives to fulfill unless the ultimate goal is displacement. At that context, the Trump plan idea, plus rhetoric from some Israeli officials, it raises deep concerns, especially among U.S. Arab allies, but really across the international community. When a major power like the U.S. is even perceived as considering something like population displacement, it just destroys the trust needed for any real talks. And, ironically, it can fuel the conflict by making Palestinian fears about their very existence seem more real.
That really complicates how the rest of the world sees this. So, beyond the main players and the mediators, how is the wider world reacting? Are diplomatic positions shifting?
They definitely are. We've seen more than 24 Western countries, including some traditional allies of Israel like Poland, the UK, Italy, publicly accuse Israel of drip-feeding aid and, quote, inhumane killing of civilians. That's strong language, and it signals a real shift, growing frustration even among friends.
And France took a big step too, didn't they? Announcing they'd recognize a Palestinian state. That was called a diplomatic blow to Israel. It certainly got a reaction. That sarcastic social media post from the U.S. ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, really highlights those tensions.
And connecting this to public sentiment, especially in the Arab world, there's this interesting and potentially very important growing trend to renounce violence in the big protests. They seem increasingly focused on protecting Palestinians, demanding aid, and strongly condemning any displacement plans rather than calling for attacks on Israel itself. But analysts warn the shift towards nonviolence is really fragile. If those core demands aren't met, if there's no diplomatic progress, it could easily flip back.
That's a huge point for regional stability.
Yeah.
And throughout all this, what about the hostages? That remains such a central, agonizing piece of the puzzle for the families and for the talks.
Absolutely. Around 20 living Israeli hostages are still believed to be held in Gaza. Hamas is sticking to its demand for a comprehensive prisoner swap, trading those hostages for a large number of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails, and the recent recovery of 6 dead hostages from a tunnel in Gaza. That's only increased the pressure back home on Netanyahu to make a deal. It just underscores the terrible human cost on all sides.
Such a deeply charged, incredibly complex situation. But despite this latest public collapse of the talks, there might be a tiny flicker of, well, continued effort. We're hearing talks might resume.
That's the latest report, yes. According to Egyptian's state-affiliated TV, ceasefire talks are actually expected to resume next week. Anisul, it's fragile hope, for sure, given everything we've discussed, but it suggests that the diplomatic track, however strained, isn't completely dead. And we're also seeing those wider regional tensions, like Yemen's Houthis threatening ships linked to Israeli ports again. It shows how this conflict keeps sending ripples outwards.
What a truly multifaceted, difficult situation we've dug into today. So wrapping this up, what does this all mean for you listening in, trying to stay informed? How do these clashing accusations, these starkly different stories, and this awful ongoing humanitarian crisis challenge how we think about peace and resolving conflicts today?
Yeah, amidst all the finger-pointing, the suffering, and these sort of fragile hints of talks resuming, what really stands out to you as the biggest single obstacle to finding any kind of lasting peace here? And maybe thinking bigger, what role are the different international players truly playing? Are they helping mediate? Or are they, maybe inadvertently, helping to keep these incredibly complex realities going? Something to really mull over.